I was lying on a cold examination table with blood soaking through the paper gown beneath me, terrified I was losing our baby, when my husband didn't answer his phone because he was holding his first love's hand in a coffee shop 3 blocks away, promising her that some loves never really die. That single afternoon broke something in me that would never be put back together the same way, and it also became the exact moment I finally started becoming whole. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet kind of hope that rebuilds a life from nothing, I want you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like this one belong to our family, our community, and everyone who has ever had to choose themselves in order to survive. My name is Rosalind Fenwick, though everyone who loves me calls me Rosie, and for 6 years I believed I understood the shape of my own life. I grew up in a small town outside Portland where the rain fell so often that people stopped complaining about it and simply learned to love the color green it left behind on everything. My mother, Eleanor, raised me and my younger sister Charlotte alone after our father left when I was 11, and from her I learned 2 things that would define the rest of my life: how to work hard without complaint, and how to recognize when a man's promises were made of paper rather than stone. I thought I had learned that lesson well. I thought I had chosen a man built from something sturdier. Julian Ashcombe walked into my life during my 2nd year of nursing school, in a hospital cafeteria where he was visiting his grandmother, an elderly woman named Constance who had broken her hip and who, despite her pain, spent most of her hospital stay trying to set her grandson up with every unmarried nurse on the floor. Julian had an easy laugh and kind eyes and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only interesting person in the room. He was training to be an architect then, all rolled up blueprints and coffee-stained notebooks, and he used to tell me that he wanted to design buildings that made people feel safe the moment they walked through the door. I fell in love with that idea before I fell in love with him, and then I fell in love with him so completely that I stopped noticing the small warning signs that appeared over the years, the way a person stops noticing a crack in the ceiling once they've lived under it long enough. We married in a small ceremony in my mother's backyard, under a maple tree that Charlotte decorated with paper lanterns because we couldn't afford anything fancier, and I remember thinking, as Julian slid the ring onto my finger, that I had never felt so certain of anything in my entire life. What I did not know then, what he never fully told me in those early years, was that there had been someone before me, a woman named Camille Renshaw, his first love from architecture school, the woman he had once planned an entire future with before circumstances I didn't understand had pulled them apart. Julian spoke of her rarely, and when he did, it was in the careful, distant tone people use when describing a wound that has scarred over but never quite healed. I told myself it didn't matter. Everyone has a past. I told myself that whatever he had felt for her belonged to a version of him that no longer existed, a boy who had grown into the man standing beside me at the altar. For the first 4 years of our marriage, I believed that completely. Julian worked long hours at a mid-sized architecture firm downtown, slowly climbing toward the partnership he'd always dreamed of, and I worked as a labor and delivery nurse at Grantwood Memorial Hospital, a job that filled me with a strange, aching joy every time I helped bring a new life into the world while quietly wondering when it would be my turn. We tried for years to have a baby of our own, enduring the particular loneliness of watching due dates pass without ever seeing 2 pink lines, the quiet grief of every negative test that Julian would find me crying over in the bathroom, always gentle in those years, always the one who would sit on the tile floor beside me and remind me that our story wasn't over yet. I loved him fiercely during that season of waiting. I believed we were the kind of couple who could survive anything because we had already survived so much heartbreak together, side by side, in the same direction. When I finally became pregnant, in the spring of what should have been the happiest year of my life, something in Julian shifted, though I didn't understand it right away. He grew distracted in a way that felt different from ordinary stress. He started taking phone calls in the garage with the door shut. He began working later, then later still, coming home smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, something floral and expensive that I told myself was probably just cologne testers at the mall or a coworker's overpowering scent lingering in a shared elevator. I was 6 months pregnant and desperately wanted to believe in the man I had built my entire adult life around, so I chose, again and again, to believe the easiest version of events rather than the truest one. Looking back now, I understand that a part of me already knew. A part of me had known for weeks. But knowing and admitting are two very different kinds of courage, and I did not yet have the second kind. The morning everything changed began like any other Tuesday. I woke up with a dull ache low in my back that I dismissed as the ordinary discomfort of late pregnancy, made myself a cup of decaf tea, and sat by the kitchen window watching the sunrise paint our small backyard gold. Julian left early that morning, kissing my forehead the way he always did, telling me he had an important client meeting he couldn't reschedule. I remember watching his car pull out of the driveway and feeling a small, unnamed unease settle into my chest, the kind of feeling you get when something is wrong but you can't yet name what it is. By mid-morning, the ache in my back had sharpened into something unmistakable, a deep cramping pain that made me grip the kitchen counter, and when I looked down and saw blood, my entire world tilted sideways. I called Julian first, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady, but it went straight to voicemail. I told myself he was in his meeting, that he'd call back any minute, and I called my sister Charlotte instead, who arrived at my house within 12 minutes, having driven faster than she probably should have, and drove me straight to Grantwood Memorial, the same hospital where I had spent years caring for other frightened, bleeding women without ever imagining I would become one of them. The drive felt endless. Charlotte kept one hand on the wheel and one hand reaching back to squeeze mine, telling me to breathe, telling me the baby was strong, telling me everything would be fine in a voice that trembled just enough to betray her own fear. At the hospital, they rushed me into an exam room, and a doctor named Dr. Whitlock, a woman with steady hands and a calm, measured voice, performed an ultrasound while I lay there with tears streaming sideways into my hair, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years, bargaining with a universe that felt entirely indifferent to my terror. The minutes stretched into something unbearable. I kept my eyes fixed on the small monitor beside the bed, searching for the flutter of a heartbeat, and when I finally heard it, strong and steady and fast, I sobbed with a relief so total it felt like drowning in reverse. Dr. Whitlock explained gently that I had experienced a partial placental abruption, serious but currently stable, and that I would need to be monitored closely, possibly admitted overnight, possibly placed on bed rest for the remainder of the pregnancy. I nodded through my tears, gripping Charlotte's hand, and asked the nurse beside me, a woman I recognized from years of working alongside her, if someone could please try my husband again. They tried. I tried. Charlotte tried. For nearly 3 hours, my phone sat useless in my hand while I lay in that hospital bed not knowing if I was going to lose my baby, and the one person who was supposed to be beside me, the man who had promised in front of everyone we loved to stand with me through every storm, was nowhere to be found. It was Charlotte who finally found him, not through any call he answered, but through sheer instinct and desperation. She remembered him mentioning, months earlier, a coffee shop near his office called the Gable Room, a place he used to go, he'd said once in passing, back when he was young and reckless and in love for the first time. Something about the way he'd said it, wistful and far away, had stuck with her, the way small strange details sometimes lodge themselves in memory and wait for the moment they'll matter. She drove there herself while I stayed hooked to monitors, terrified and alone, and what she found through the coffee shop's front window would change the rest of my life. She told me later, gently, sitting beside my hospital bed with her voice breaking, that she had seen Julian sitting across from a woman with dark auburn hair, their hands intertwined on the small round table between them, his head bent close to hers in a posture of intimacy that no accidental, innocent meeting could explain. Charlotte didn't go inside. She stood frozen on the sidewalk for a moment, and then she did something that took more courage than I could have managed in her position. She called the number listed for the coffee shop from her cell phone, asked to speak with a customer matching Julian's description, and when the barista walked the phone over and Julian answered, confused, Charlotte's voice came out flat and cold in a way I had never heard from my gentle sister before. She told him that his wife was in the hospital bleeding, that his baby might be dying, and that if he cared even slightly about either of us, he needed to leave that coffee shop and get to Grantwood Memorial immediately. He arrived 40 minutes later, breathless, his shirt collar askew, guilt written across every line of his face in a language I suddenly understood with painful clarity. He tried to explain. He said Camille had reached out weeks earlier, that she was going through a difficult divorce, that she had needed someone to talk to, that nothing had happened between them beyond conversation and old memories being stirred up in a way that meant nothing. He said his phone had been on silent because he hadn't wanted the meeting interrupted, an explanation so thin it dissolved the moment it left his mouth. I remember looking at him from that hospital bed, my hand resting on the curve of my belly where our daughter's heartbeat still fluttered faintly on the monitor beside me, and feeling something inside me go very quiet and very still, the particular stillness that comes not from calm but from a heart deciding, all at once, that it cannot afford to break any further. I did not scream at him in that hospital room. I did not have the strength for rage in that moment, not while I was still fighting to keep our baby safe inside me. I simply asked him to leave, and something in my voice must have carried a finality he had never heard from me before, because he left without further argument, promising he would explain everything properly once I was home and rested. I spent that night in the hospital under careful observation, Charlotte curled uncomfortably in the chair beside my bed refusing to go home, and somewhere in the long, dark hours between midnight and dawn, I made a decision that I would spend the rest of my life grateful for, even though it would break my heart into more pieces than I thought a person could survive. The bleeding stabilized by morning, and Dr. Whitlock, after another ultrasound confirmed our daughter's heartbeat remained strong, released me with strict instructions for bed rest and a follow-up appointment within the week. Charlotte drove me not home to the house I shared with Julian, but to our mother's house instead, the same modest house with the maple tree in the backyard where I had married him 6 years earlier. My mother met me at the door with an expression that held no judgment, only the fierce, unwavering love of a woman who had once walked this same road herself. She simply opened her arms and said that my old room was exactly as I'd left it, and that I would stay there for as long as I needed, and that whatever I decided to do about my marriage, she would stand behind me completely. Julian called relentlessly over the following days. He sent flowers to my mother's house that I asked her to donate to the hospital's oncology ward instead. He wrote long emails explaining, apologizing, promising that his connection with Camille was purely emotional, purely about processing old grief, that he had never once considered leaving me, that he loved only me and our unborn daughter. I read every word of those emails, searching for some version of the truth I could survive believing, but each time I finished reading, I returned to the same unbearable fact that no explanation could erase. On the day I might have lost our baby, on the day my body was failing in the most terrifying way possible, my husband had chosen to sit in a coffee shop holding another woman's hand instead of answering his phone. Whatever his intentions had been, whatever he called that meeting in his own mind, he had made a choice in that moment, and the choice had not been me. I want to pause here and ask you something, because this is the part of the story where I think the deepest lesson begins to take root. If you have ever had to choose between the comfortable lie and the painful truth, between staying somewhere familiar and walking towards something uncertain but honest, I would love for you to share in the comments what gave you the courage to choose truth. Your stories matter to this community, and I read every single one. The following weeks passed in a strange, suspended blur of doctor's appointments, difficult conversations, and the particular exhaustion of carrying a child while your heart is simultaneously breaking. Julian requested to see me in person, and against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a small park near my mother's house, a neutral place with wide open daylight and other people around, because some instinct told me I needed witnesses to whatever truth might finally emerge. We sat on a bench beneath a row of dogwood trees just beginning to bloom, and I asked him the only question that mattered. I asked him to tell me, honestly, without softening it for my sake, exactly what he felt for Camille Renshaw. What followed was the most honest conversation of our entire marriage, delivered 6 years too late. Julian told me, haltingly at first and then with a kind of desperate momentum, that he and Camille had been engaged once, years before he met me, and that she had broken off their engagement suddenly to move across the country for a career opportunity, leaving him devastated in a way he had never fully processed. He said that when she reached out months earlier, newly divorced and struggling, something in him had responded before he could stop it, some unfinished part of himself reaching toward unfinished business. He said he loved me. He said he had never planned to be unfaithful. But when I asked him, directly, whether he could promise me that his heart belonged fully and only to me and to our daughter, he hesitated. That hesitation, that single beat of silence beneath the dogwood trees, told me everything his words had been trying to avoid. I did not yell. I did not cry, not there on that bench, though I would cry plenty in private in the weeks that followed. I simply told him that I could not build a life on a foundation with cracks he wasn't even willing to name honestly, that our daughter deserved a father who chose his family completely, without hesitation, without the ghost of someone else sitting between us at every table. I told him I needed time, and space, and the truth, in that order, and that until he could give me all three, I would be staying at my mother's house. He didn't fight me on it. I think, in some quiet corner of himself, he knew I was right, even if he wasn't yet ready to admit what that truth would cost him. The months that followed were among the hardest of my life, and also, strangely, among the most clarifying. I continued my prenatal care under Dr. Whitlock's careful supervision, my body slowly healing from the abruption scare, my belly growing rounder with each passing week. I returned to light duty at the hospital where I could, finding an unexpected comfort in caring for other expectant mothers even as my own situation remained unresolved. My mother and Charlotte became the scaffolding that held me upright during those months, my mother cooking meals I barely had appetite for but ate anyway because she insisted, Charlotte driving me to appointments and sitting with me through ultrasounds, both of them absorbing the parts of my grief I couldn't yet carry alone. Julian, to his credit, did not disappear during this time. He began attending counseling on his own, something he had always resisted before, and he wrote to me weekly, not with excuses anymore, but with a kind of raw self-examination that surprised me. He admitted that he had spent years avoiding the grief of his broken engagement to Camille rather than processing it, that he had carried an idealized, frozen version of her in some untouched corner of his heart, a version that had nothing to do with who she actually was now, a wounded, complicated woman going through her own painful divorce. He wrote that seeing her again had not been about choosing her over me, but about running from a grief he had never properly grieved, and that in doing so, he had failed the one promise that mattered most, the promise to be fully present for the family we were building together. I believed, reading those letters, that he meant every word. But belief and readiness are different things, and I was not yet ready to hand him back the fragile, healing pieces of my heart. In late autumn, on a bright, cold morning with frost still clinging to my mother's maple tree, I went into labor 3 weeks early. Charlotte drove me to Grantwood Memorial for the second time that year, though this drive felt entirely different from the terrified one months earlier, charged instead with a nervous, hopeful energy. I called Julian from the hospital, and this time he answered on the first ring, arriving within 15 minutes, his face pale with worry and something that looked almost like penance. He stayed beside me through 11 hours of labor, holding my hand, wiping my forehead, whispering encouragement in a voice thick with emotion, and when our daughter finally arrived, small and furious and perfect, letting out a cry that filled the entire delivery room, I watched Julian break down completely, sobbing over her tiny form in a way I had never seen him cry before, not even during our darkest months. We named her Wren, a small, fierce, singing bird of a name for a small, fierce, singing bird of a girl. Holding her for the first time, feeling the impossible weight and lightness of her all at once, I felt something in my chest shift permanently. Whatever happened between Julian and me from that point forward, I understood with absolute clarity that my first responsibility now belonged to her, to giving her a life built on honesty rather than convenient silence, on strength rather than fear. I looked at Julian across the hospital bed, both of us crying, both of us changed forever by the small, red-faced creature between us, and I told him, gently but firmly, that loving Wren meant I needed him to prove, through consistent action rather than beautiful words, that he had truly let go of whatever unfinished business still lingered in his heart. He promised he would. And for a while, it seemed like he might. For the first several months of Wren's life, Julian visited daily, though I remained at my mother's house, unwilling to rush back into a shared home before I was certain the foundation beneath us had actually changed. He learned to change diapers with clumsy, endearing determination. He sang off-key lullabies that made Wren startle and then, eventually, settle into sleep against his chest. He continued his counseling, and slowly, carefully, I allowed myself to hope that our family might find its way back to wholeness. I want to be honest with you here, because I think honesty is the entire point of telling this story. I loved him still. Despite everything, despite the fear and the fury and the fresh scar tissue over my heart, I loved him, and some nights, rocking Ren to sleep alone in my childhood bedroom, I let myself imagine a future where we healed completely, where this became simply a difficult chapter rather than the ending. That hope shattered again on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, 7 months after Ren's birth, when Charlotte, doing errands downtown, saw Julian's car parked outside Camille's apartment building, the same car he'd told me was in the shop for the entire weekend. She sat outside for nearly an hour, debating whether to tell me, before finally deciding, once again, that I deserved the truth more than I deserved false comfort. When I confronted Julian that evening, he didn't deny it immediately, which somehow hurt worse than an outright lie would have. He explained that Camille had called him in crisis, that her divorce had finalized that week and she'd had no one else to turn to, that he had gone to check on her purely as an old friend, nothing more. He seemed genuinely bewildered by my anger, genuinely convinced that his intentions rendered the action harmless, and it was in that bewilderment, more than in the visit itself, that I finally understood the truth I had been avoiding for a year. Julian did not fully understand, even now, even after everything we had survived, why his continued emotional availability to Camille was a betrayal of the family he claimed to be fighting for. He loved me. I believed that completely. But he had never fully closed the door on his first love, and some doors, left open even a crack, eventually blow wide open again in a strong enough wind. I held Ren that night, 7 months old and blissfully unaware of the storm around her, her small fingers curled around mine, and I made the second great decision of my life, the one that would ultimately give this story its title. I decided I would not spend the next 20 years of my life competing with a ghost for my husband's full presence. I decided that Ren deserved a mother who modeled self-respect rather than endurance, who taught her, through action rather than lecture, that love without complete honesty is not actually love at all, but merely its convincing imitation. I told Julian, calmly and without theatrics, that I was filing for legal separation, that I would be taking Ren and building a new life for the two of us, and that he was welcome to be a present, loving father, but that I could no longer be his wife while some part of him remained unfinished business with someone else. He begged me to reconsider. He promised, with tears in his eyes, that he would cut off all contact with Camille completely, that he would prove himself however long it took. I believed his sincerity. I did not doubt, then or now, that in that moment he meant every word. But I had learned something crucial during that difficult year, something I think many people spend their entire lives avoiding learning, that a person's sincerity in the moment does not undo the pattern of their choices over time, and that real love requires more than good intentions during confrontations. It requires consistent, unglamorous, everyday choosing, especially when no one is watching, especially when the coffee shop door seems easy to walk through and no one would ever know. I could not build my daughter's childhood, or the remaining decades of my own life, on the hope that this time, finally, the pattern would break. I needed him to have already broken it, on his own, before crisis forced his hand. And he hadn't. The separation, and eventually the divorce, unfolded over the following year with far more grace than either of us expected, largely because we both refused to let our pain turn into weapons aimed at each other, mindful always of the small girl who would someday be old enough to understand every word we said about her father, about her mother, about the family that had once tried and failed to stay whole. Julian moved into a small apartment across town. He saw Ren every week without fail, showing up early, staying late, learning to braid her wispy baby hair, learning her favorite songs, becoming, slowly and imperfectly, the kind of steady presence I had always hoped he could be. His relationship with Camille, as far as I ever learned, did not survive either. Grief and nostalgia, it turned out, make poor foundations for anything lasting, and within a year she had moved away again, this time for good, leaving Julian to sit with the consequences of choices he could no longer blame on anyone else's presence in his life. I want to tell you something about the months right after the divorce finalized, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most, more than the betrayal, more than the hospital bed, more than even the birth of my daughter. This is the part about becoming someone new. I moved out of my mother's house that summer into a small rented duplex not far from the hospital, close enough that Ren could stay in her familiar daycare, close enough that my mother and Charlotte could still drop by on short notice with groceries or simply an extra pair of hands. I returned to full-time work at Grantwood Memorial, and something unexpected happened as I settled back into the rhythm of caring for other families welcoming their own babies into the world. I began to heal, not in spite of the hardship I had endured, but somehow through the very act of witnessing other people's joy and fear and courage day after day. Every mother I helped through a difficult delivery reminded me of my own strength. Every father who showed up fully present for his partner reminded me that such men existed, that Julian's failures did not represent the failure of all men, only his own particular unfinished grief. I started small traditions with Ren that were entirely our own, unburdened by the ghosts of my marriage. We spent Saturday mornings at the farmer's market near our new home, Ren perched in a carrier against my chest and later, as she grew, toddling beside me with a fierce independence that made the market vendors laugh every single week. We planted a small garden in the tiny patch of dirt behind our duplex, nothing fancy, just tomatoes and marigolds and a stubborn patch of mint that spread further than I ever intended, and I found something deeply healing in watching things grow under my own care, in my own soil, on my own terms. I reconnected with old friends I had let slip away during the isolating years of my marriage, women who welcomed me back without judgment, who showed up with wine and takeout on the hardest nights and never once made me feel like a burden for needing them. Slowly, almost without my noticing the exact moment it happened, I stopped defining myself as the woman whose husband had chosen his first love over her in a moment of crisis. I began defining myself instead as Ren's mother, as a skilled and compassionate nurse who had helped bring hundreds of babies safely into the world, as a daughter who had finally learned to accept her own mother's hard-won wisdom, as a sister whose bond with Charlotte had deepened into something unbreakable through shared crisis. As a woman who had chosen honesty over comfortable illusion even when it cost her everything she thought she wanted. I began, in short, to like the person I was becoming, and that liking, that quiet self-respect, turned out to be worth more than any promise Julian could ever have made me. None of this healing happened in a straight line, and I don't want to pretend it did, because I think stories that promise easy, linear recovery do a disservice to anyone actually walking through real grief. There were nights I cried into Ren's baby blankets after she'd fallen asleep, mourning the family I thought we would be, the anniversaries we would never celebrate, the version of Julian I had married who I now understood had never fully existed in the way I believed. There were mornings I woke up exhausted from single parenthood, from the particular loneliness of making every decision alone, from watching other families at the park with two parents splitting the work of chasing a toddler and feeling a fresh wave of grief for what I had lost. Healing, I learned, is not the absence of pain. It is the slow, patient practice of building a life alongside the pain rather than being buried beneath it. 2 years after Ren's birth, on a bright September afternoon while I was setting up a small table at the farmer's market for a hospital fundraiser, I met a man named Thomas Everly, a soft-spoken elementary school teacher who ran the honey stand 2 tables down from mine, tending bees in his backyard as a hobby that had somehow turned into a small local business. He had kind, unhurried eyes and a habit of crouching down to speak directly to children at their own height, which is how our paths first properly crossed, when Ren, then 2.5 and utterly fearless, wandered over to his table and demanded, with the imperious confidence only a toddler can manage, to taste every single flavor of honey he had for sale. He laughed, crouched down to her level, and patiently let her try 3 different jars while I apologized, and he waved off my apology entirely, telling me she had excellent taste and clearly knew exactly what she wanted from life. I did not fall in love with Thomas quickly, and I am grateful for that slowness now, because it meant that what eventually grew between us was built on genuine friendship first, on months of easy conversation at the market, on him remembering small details about my life and Ren's favorite foods, on the way he never once pushed for more than I was ready to give. It took nearly a year of friendship before I let myself consider anything more, and even then I moved carefully, cautiously, having learned the hard way what happens when you build a life on a foundation you haven't properly tested. Thomas, unlike Julian, had no unfinished business haunting the edges of his heart. He had loved once before, briefly, in his 20s, and that relationship had simply ended the way early relationships often do, without lasting wounds, without ghosts requiring exorcism years later in coffee shops while someone else bled in a hospital bed. What struck me most about Thomas, in those early months of dating, was how he treated Ren, not as an obstacle to be managed or a complication to be tolerated, but as a genuine, delightful person in her own right, someone he was excited to know better regardless of whether things worked out between him and me. He built her a small wooden bee box for her room, painted with flowers, and spent an entire Saturday afternoon teaching her, with endless patience, how bees pollinate flowers, crouched beside her in his garden while she asked approximately 400 questions and he answered every single one without a trace of impatience. Watching him with her, I felt something in my chest unclench that I hadn't even realized was still tightly wound, a fear I had been carrying since the divorce that perhaps I had ruined my chance at a whole, uncomplicated family, that perhaps Ren would grow up knowing only the model of a father who loved him perfectly and a mother who had to leave to protect them both. Julian, to his enormous credit, continued growing during these years as well, and I want to honor that growth honestly, because this story is not meant to villainize him permanently, but to show something more true and more complicated, which is that people can fail catastrophically and still, through sustained effort, become better versions of themselves, even if that growth comes too late to save what was broken. He completed a full year of individual therapy, then continued in a men's support group he found through his church, working specifically through the grief he had never processed after Camille first left him decades earlier. He wrote me a letter, nearly 2 years after our divorce finalized, that I still keep folded in a drawer, not because I need it, but because it represents something important, a man finally understanding, fully and without excuse, the exact nature of the harm he had caused. He wrote that he understood now that he had asked me to compete with a memory for years without ever telling me the rules of that competition, that he had let his own unprocessed grief bleed into our marriage and nearly cost us everything, including, on that terrifying day in the hospital, quite literally everything. He did not ask for reconciliation in that letter. He asked only for my forgiveness, not to erase what happened, but so that he could stop carrying the weight of it in a way that poisoned his ability to be fully present for Ren. I forgave him. I want to be very clear about what that forgiveness meant and did not mean, because I think this is a point many people misunderstand. Forgiving Julian did not mean forgetting what happened, or minimizing the harm, or reopening a door I had firmly and correctly closed. It meant releasing the anger I had been carrying, not for his sake, but for my own, because I had learned by then that unforgiveness is its own kind of prison, one that keeps you tethered to the person who hurt you long after they've stopped actively hurting you. Forgiving him meant I could watch him pick Ren up for their weekend visits without my stomach twisting into knots. It meant I could sit across from him at her preschool graduation, both of us crying with pride, without the old grief overwhelming the moment. It meant I could finally, fully, walk into my future with Thomas without dragging the full weight of my past behind me like a chain. If you have ever had to forgive someone who hurt you deeply, not for their sake but for your own freedom, I would love to hear about that journey in the comments below, because I believe those stories are exactly the kind of hope our community needs to hear. Thomas and I married 3 years after Ren's birth, in a small ceremony held, fittingly, in my mother's backyard beneath the same maple tree where I had married Julian, a choice that might seem strange to some but felt, to me, like a reclamation rather than a haunting. My mother had planted new flowers around its base that spring, bright yellow marigolds that Ren, now 3 and delighted to be the flower girl, insisted on picking and rearranging throughout the entire ceremony. Julian attended, sitting quietly in the back row, and I remember catching his eye during the vows and seeing not bitterness there, but something that looked genuinely like peace, the particular peace of a man who has done the hard work of accepting the consequences of his own choices and found, on the other side of that acceptance, an unexpected freedom of his own. Thomas adopted Ren legally 2 years after our wedding, a decision Julian himself encouraged, understanding, in his own continued growth, that Ren needed the daily, steady presence of the man who was actually raising her while still maintaining his own relationship with her as her biological father. A complicated but ultimately loving arrangement that took all of us significant effort and no small amount of humility to navigate successfully. Ren, now 7 years old as I write this, calls Thomas Dad and Julian Papa, a distinction she came to naturally on her own, and she moves between both relationships with a security and confidence that fills me with a fierce, grateful pride every single time I watch her navigate it. She knows, in the simple, age-appropriate terms we've explained to her, that her parents made a hard decision together because they loved her too much to stay in a home built on things that weren't quite true, and that both of the men in her life love her completely, even though our family looks different than some other families do. I think often, especially on quiet mornings when I'm alone in my kitchen before the rest of the house wakes up, about that terrified young woman lying on a hospital table, bleeding and afraid, wondering if her husband would ever answer his phone. I think about how impossible it would have seemed to her, in that moment of raw terror, that this same crisis would eventually lead to the life I now have, a life so much fuller and more honest than the one I had been quietly settling for in the years before. I do not believe that everything happens for a reason, not in the tidy, comforting way that phrase sometimes gets used. I believe, instead, that terrible things happen, and that what matters most is what we choose to build afterward with the broken pieces we're left holding. I could have stayed in a marriage that asked me to compete indefinitely with a memory. I could have let bitterness harden into the permanent shape of my heart. Instead, I chose, again and again, in 100 small daily decisions, to build something honest, even when honest was harder than easy would have been. Grantwood Memorial promoted me eventually to a senior position coordinating care for high-risk pregnancies, a role I find deeply meaningful precisely because of what I survived, because I understand, in a way that textbook training alone cannot teach, exactly what it feels like to lie on that table wondering if your world is ending. I've held the hands of dozens of women since then, some facing medical crises, some facing the crumbling of relationships they thought were solid, and I tell all of them the same thing I eventually learned to believe about myself, that surviving the worst day of your life does not mean your story is over, that it might, in fact, mean your real story is only just beginning. My relationship with my mother deepened even further during these years, and I finally understood, in a way I hadn't as a younger woman, the particular strength it must have taken her to raise Charlotte and me alone after our father left, without the resources, without the support system I was fortunate enough to have, without even the language, back then, to describe what we now call resilience and self-worth and boundaries. She never once said, "I told you so," during my darkest months with Julian, though she would have been entirely justified in doing so, having recognized his patterns before I was ready to see them myself. Instead, she simply held space for me, cooked for me, cared for Ren when I needed rest, and modeled, through her own quiet steadiness, exactly the kind of strength I would eventually need to draw on myself. Charlotte, too, became something more than a sister during that year of crisis. She became the kind of fierce, unwavering ally that some people search their entire lives for and never find, and I do not know how I would have survived those months without her willingness to drive to a coffee shop and confront an uncomfortable truth on my behalf when I was too frightened and too heartbroken to face it myself. I want to speak directly, for a moment, to anyone listening to this story who currently finds themselves in the position I once occupied, lying in some version of that hospital bed, waiting for a call that never comes, sensing a truth you're not yet ready to fully face. I know how frightening it feels to consider that the life you've built, the person you've centered your entire identity around, might not be the solid ground you believed it to be. I know how much easier it feels, in the short term, to accept a convenient explanation rather than sit with an inconvenient truth. But I promise you, from the other side of that terror, that you are capable of far more strength than you currently believe you possess. The version of yourself waiting on the other side of honesty, however painful the path there might be, is worth walking toward. You do not have to spend your entire life competing with someone else's unfinished business for a place at your own table. Before I close this story, I want to ask you to take a moment and leave a comment below sharing what this story stirred in you, whether it's a memory of your own courage, a lesson about forgiveness you've had to learn the hard way, or simply a word of encouragement for someone else reading these comments who might currently be sitting in their own version of that hospital bed, waiting for a phone call that isn't coming. Our community grows stronger every time we share these truths with each other, and I read every single comment with gratitude. Ren is 7 now, all elbows and knees and fierce opinions, exactly as her name suggested she would be from the moment I first heard her cry in that delivery room. She wants to be a marine biologist, or possibly a beekeeper like Thomas, or possibly, depending on the day, both simultaneously, and she asks me constantly about the ocean and about honey and about whether bees ever get tired, a question I still haven't found a satisfying answer to. She knows nothing of the fear I carried on the day she nearly arrived too early, nothing of the coffee shop or the hospital bed or the year of careful, painful decisions that shaped the family she now takes entirely for granted, the way children blessedly should be able to take their families for granted. What she knows is a home full of laughter, 2 parents who love her fiercely even though they no longer love each other, a grandmother who bakes her favorite cookies every Sunday, an aunt who takes her for ice cream after every dentist appointment regardless of how the appointment went, and a stepfather who taught her to love bees and gardens and the particular patience required to watch something grow slowly, season by season, into something beautiful. I sometimes wonder what my life would look like if I had made different choices during that terrible year, if I had accepted Julian's explanations at face value, if I had stayed simply because staying felt safer than the terrifying uncertainty of starting over as a single mother with a newborn. I don't know, and I've stopped needing to know, because the life I actually built, the one grown from the wreckage of that hospital bed and that coffee shop and that year of careful, painful honesty, is a life I am deeply, unreservedly proud of. I did not simply survive my husband choosing his first love over me during the most terrifying moment of my life. I took that devastation and built something entirely new from it, a life defined not by what was taken from me, but by what I chose, deliberately and courageously, to build in its place. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the lesson or the feeling it stirred in you, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder of their own strength today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of resilience, forgiveness, and hope. Our community exists because people like you keep showing up for these stories, keep believing that broken things can become whole again in new and unexpected shapes, and keep reminding each other that it is never too late to choose honesty over comfort, and never too late to build the life you actually deserve. Every spring now, when the marigolds bloom again around the base of my mother's maple tree, I think about the woman I used to be, bleeding and frightened and waiting for a phone call, and I send her, across the distance of years, a quiet message of gratitude. She did not know, in that terrible moment, that she was standing at the exact threshold of the life she truly wanted, disguised as the worst day of her life. She did not know that choosing to leave would not mean choosing loneliness, but choosing instead the slow, patient, daily work of building a home filled with real honesty, real laughter, and real love. Sometimes the most painful endings are simply the universe clearing space for the beginning you never knew to hope for, and if you are standing at your own frightening threshold right now, uncertain and afraid, I want you to know that you, too, are capable of walking through it, and of finding, on the other side, a life more honestly yours than anything you left behind.